layer here, you're going to want to set your layer mode to multiply. Alright, now the magic happens. Now, I have been doing this for a little bit, so I already created some watercolor brushes that I really like, but I'll get into that in some of the future parts of the screencast. For now, I can at least show you what this looks like. When I paint with regular Photoshop brushes on this masked group, this is what it looks like. This is not a special brush. It's really actually a very, very simple brush. Doesn't have a lot going on, but because the texture, paper texture, is populating this mask, it allows the what would be the whiteness of paper to show through, and it gives it that very appealing dappled look. But that's not all. There are a couple other things that this affords us. One of the advantages of watercolor painting, one of the really fun things about it, is to be able to blend colors by painting into paint that's already wet. If you're working with real watercolors and you have paint that's still wet, you can pick another color and then put it down and use a little bit of water to mix them together on the page. And it just so happens that this system lets us do that. So I'm going to take a little bit of this blue and start just kind of adding a little bit in here. And then use my blender tool, which I saved from before, and blending within this watercolor layer really gets the natural look of when you take two paint colors and mix them together. It starts to dull out a little bit, but it still maintains that that believability. Now, the next component that we want to emulate is the layering and the transparency, and that of course is going to be simple. Create another layer, set its blending mode to multiply, and then start in again with the next pass. And you can see that this new layer is darkening, and it's also going to introduce its color relative to the layers that are underneath it. And the best part, of course, is the fact that because this is a separate layer, we can go back and the layer underneath is still wet relative to itself. So I can go in and I can change the layer underneath to blue, and now this layer on top is interacting with the layer underneath, even though relative to itself it's dry. So to say that in a better way, when you're on a layer it's always wet, but when you go to the layer on top of it, the layer on top of it is behaving as though the layer underneath it is now dry. So you get the look of layering in watercolors, but you get the flexibility of always being able to go back and change things. You can also erase, which of course you can't do with regular watercolors. You can get very subtle edge variation if you want. You can leave some edges hard and blend other ones all the way into the paper. You can, just by using the flow control of your brush, you can get hard-edged, dense watercolors like sable brushes that look like this. Sorry. Where you have a hard edge, but you can diffuse one part of the edge into the paper with your blending tool. Then you can go back in, bring the flow all the way very, very low to 5 or even lower than 5, and you start getting lovely washes that you can blend and layer. You will reach a limit even if you create many layers and multiply many layers, you will reach a limit of how intense the color can be by virtue of the fact that this group is masked. And the way to get around that is to create another group on top, do the exact same thing, make a mask, fill the mask with your texture. You can even change the texture if you want to introduce a new variation to your layer. Brighten it up a little bit using levels, as we did before. Create a new layer inside. And through this you can continue to build up the intensity of your composition until you get very, very dense and opaque color. You can see right here that we've got some really nice interplay of a variety of different colors, some interesting places where it really looks like the paint is lying on the fibers of paper, and this is something that I have not seen in other techniques that people have devised, so I'd like to take credit for it if I can. And then, of course, it goes without saying that because we're in Photoshop, we have all of the native benefits of using Photoshop, like being able to make masks on our individual layers, being able to lock transparency, and in general, being able to modify and constrain things to the extent that we want. The last thing I'll just point out, because it's just one of a cute little afterthought, is that if you create a layer in a watercolor masked group and you do not change the blending mode to multiply, let's say you forget, or you say, I just want this to be normal, what you will have done is to create a layer that is pretty much like gouache, like opaque watercolor. So if I go over this, I get the same texture but without the transparency. And if you've worked with watercolor and gouache, you'll know that they really do go together. When you want to do highlights or you want to do special effects on top of your watercolor painting, you end up using things like white gouache, and that works perfectly in this system. All you have to do is leave your blending mode as normal. If you wanted to do an entire gouache painting, you could. But usually a mix of transparency and opacity is going to be preferred. In the next section, I'll talk about ways of making your different watercolor brushes, and it's much simpler than it even seems. The group mask is doing all of the work here. I'm actually kind of amazed. And just to show you how much it's doing, I'm going to show you what these layers look like without the masks in place. And I think you will be shocked. So take a good look at what this looks like. And now look at what it looks like without the layer mask. Take away this one too. It looks pretty disgusting. It looks like what most people's beginner Photoshop coloring looks like. It's very harsh. It looks like slick airbrushing, and it doesn't even have the kind of color blending that we want it to have. So I was just amazed when I first started working this up at how much that group mask is really doing to affect the overall look of this process.